4 hours north of everything, where the road gives out and the pines swallow the sky, stands a cabin no one was supposed to want. The roof sags. The windows are blind with boards. A young woman carries a flashlight down into its cellar, where the air smells of cold clay and something older. In her other hand, a sledgehammer. In front of her is a wall that does not belong. Gray block, crude mortar, built by a man in a hurry a lifetime ago. She swings. The block cracks. Dust blooms in the beam, and out of the dark comes a breath of stale air sharp with steel and oil. She lifts the light. Something gleams back, round, enormous, a door that weighs more than a ton sealed for 50 years. She does not yet know what she has found, but the dark is about to give up its secret. She raises the hammer again. The notice was on the door before the rain had even stopped. It was taped at eye level, a single white page swelling at the corners where the water had found it, and the woman who read it was 21 years old and had nowhere else to go. Her name was Marin Tavares. She had lived behind that door for 9 years in a third-floor apartment in a tired old mill town on the coast of Massachusetts, in a building where the rent had stayed low because the city once cared whether working people could afford to stay. Her father was 8 months in the ground. Her savings had shrunk to a little over $17,000, which sounds like a great deal of money until you understand that it was all the money in the world she would ever have, and that the world was about to take the roof from over her head. She would spend almost every cent of it on a dead man's cabin 4 hours north in a county so far up in the New Hampshire woods that the clerk who sold it to her called it a tear down and told her she was wasting good money on rotten wood. And what nobody knew, not the clerk, not her mother, not the men who put that notice on the door, was that something lay buried beneath that rotten wood, something a dead man had sealed away with his own 2 hands and waited the rest of his life for the right person to find. But we are getting ahead of the story. We have to go back before the cabin, back to the door and the rain and the girl who stood reading her own eviction in the cold blue light of a Tuesday evening. She read it once. She did not cry. She folded the page along the wet crease, slid it into her coat pocket, and went inside to tell her mother. Marin had been a strange and serious child, the kind teachers either loved or could not figure out. While the other children drew suns with faces and houses with crooked chimneys, Marin drew floor plans. She had done it since she was 8 years old. Every place she ever lived, every relative's house she ever visited, she would walk the rooms with her hands out, counting her steps, heel to toe, and then she would go to a quiet corner and draw the whole thing from above, every wall, every doorway, every window drawn to scale on the backs of grocery receipts and church bulletins. Her father used to say she could find the bones of a house the way a doctor could read an X-ray. He said it with pride. He was a man who had spent his life with his hands first on the fishing boats out of the harbor and later in the last of the old textile mills before it closed, and he understood the dignity of a person who could look at a thing and see how it was built. His name was Gil. He died on a Thursday in October in the small hours, with his hand pressed flat to his chest as if he could hold his own heart together by sheer will. The doctor said it was the kind of thing that comes without warning. Marin knew better. She had watched the warning arrive in installments over 3 months, in the gray that crept under his eyes, in the way he stopped eating, in the way the fight with the building had hollowed him out from the inside. She knew exactly what had killed her father. It had a name and a corporate address. Here is the thing about grief that no one tells you. It does not arrive all at once. It moves in slowly like water into a basement. You do not notice it rising until the day you reach for something and find it already underwater. For her mother, the water had risen all the way to the chin. Renata Tavares was 51 years old, and she had loved one man her entire life, and now that man was gone. She had spent 30 years bent over a sewing machine, first at the garment factory and then at the kitchen table when the factory followed the mill into the grave, taking in mending and alterations from half the neighborhood, her foot on the pedal late into the night. She was a strong woman. Maren had always thought of her mother as the strongest person she knew. But strength is a kind of muscle, and muscles tear, and somewhere in the 8 months since Gil died, something in Renata had torn and not healed. She moved through the apartment like a woman underwater. She forgot to eat. She left the television on all night for the sound of voices. When Maren brought her the eviction notice, her mother looked at it for a long time. And then she looked at her daughter and she said only one thing. She said your father would have known what to do. It landed like a slap, though her mother had not meant it that way. It landed because it was true and because it meant that the knowing now fell to Maren, who was 21 and tired and alone in a way that had nothing to do with how many people were in the room. The men who held the lease called themselves Meridian Harbor Holdings. They had bought the whole block 2 years earlier through a chain of smaller companies, the way a shark moves up a river, and the man who ran the evictions was a property manager named Pierce Maddox. Maren had met him exactly once in the lobby, a man in a coat that cost more than her mother made in a season, a man with a smooth face and a soft voice and eyes that slid past you as though you were furniture in a room he was about to renovate. That word renovate was the whole trick. Meridian had filed paperwork claiming the building needed structural work so deep that every unit had to sit empty for it to be done. It was a loophole and it was legal, and it let them throw out families who had paid their rent on time for 9 years and replace them with people who would pay 4 times as much. Maren and her mother had fought it. They had pooled money with the other tenants and hired a lawyer, a decent man who did his best, and for 3 months they had sat in courtrooms and watched Meridian's lawyers stretch every hearing like taffy until the tenants ran out of money and patience, and in her father's case, time. The judge ruled for the company. He did not look like a cruel man. He looked tired the way everyone in that building looked tired, and he gave them 48 hours to be gone. 48 hours to pack up 9 years. That night, surrounded by half-filled boxes and the ghost of her father in every room, Maren did the only thing she knew how to do when the world stopped making sense. She made a plan. She sat on the floor with her laptop balanced on a packing box, and she searched for the one thing no landlord on earth could ever take away again. She searched for something they could own outright, something with a deed and 4 walls, and no man in an expensive coat standing on the other side of the lease. She searched the county tax auctions, the places where land goes when the owner dies and the taxes go unpaid, and at 1 in the morning in the blue glow of the screen, she found it. The listing was 3 lines long and the photograph was so dark you could barely make it out. A cabin deep in the great north woods of New Hampshire, 4.5 acres of timber that had not been touched in decades. The structure had been built in 1974, 1,200 square feet, 1 floor, and aloft, a steep roof, the windows boarded over. The roof in the photo sagged like the spine of an old horse. The price was $17,500 cash, only sold exactly as it stood. The previous owner, the listing said, had died with no will and no heirs, owing years of back taxes, and his name was Emmett Vale. Maren stared at that dark photograph for a long time. She was an architect, or she had been training to be one. 3 years into the program at the State University, with 2 summers behind her doing measured drawings for a contractor who restored old houses, crawling through attics and basements with a tape measure, learning the secret language of how things were put together before her father died, and the money for tuition went where money goes when a family is drowning. She had dropped out in the spring. She told herself it was temporary. She knew it was not. So when she looked at that ruined cabin, she did not see a tear down. She saw bones. She saw a frame that had stood for 50 years and a roof that could be saved and walls that wanted only to be dry. She woke her mother. "We can buy it," she said. "Outright. No mortgage, no Maddox. No one can ever put us out again." Her mother did not want to go. Of course she did not. New Bedford was the only place she had ever lived, the place where she had married Gil and raised a daughter and buried a husband, and 4 hours north was the edge of the known world, but there was nothing left to hold them, and there was almost no money, and in the end, her mother simply nodded, the way the very tired nod, and said, "Your father always wanted land." They wired the money the next morning. They were on the highway by noon. 2 days later, the car packed to the windows with everything two women owned, the rest left at the curb for whoever wanted it. The drive north was long and quiet, and somewhere past the middle of it, the country began to change. The towns grew smaller and farther apart. The phones showed fewer bars, and then no bars at all. The highway narrowed to 2 lanes, and the pines pressed in close on either side, tall and dark and old, leaning over the road like men at a graveside. The light went thin and silver. The air when Marin cracked the window smelled of cold sap and wet stone, and something older underneath, the smell of a place that had never once been in a hurry. They stopped in the only town within 20 miles, a cluster of buildings around a single crossroad, fewer than 800 people, by the sign at the edge of it. There was a gas pump and a hardware store and a small diner with steam on the windows, and because they had not eaten since morning, they went in. The diner was warm and smelled of coffee and bacon grease, and the woman behind the counter was somewhere past 60, broad and steady, with gray hair pinned up and forearms like a person who had carried a lot of plates in her life. Her name, the others called her, was Birdie. She poured them coffee without asking and brought soup without being told, the way certain women have of deciding you need feeding the moment you walk through the door. It was Renata who said it, looking for something to say to fill the silence. "We just bought a place up the North Road," she said. "The Old Vale property." The diner did not go silent, not exactly, but something shifted. A man at the counter in a flannel shirt looked up from his plate. Birdie stopped with the coffee pot a moment too long over Marin's cup. "You bought Emmett's place," Birdie said. It was not a question. Marin said yes. "We did." Birdie set the pot down. She looked at the two of them for a moment, at the girl with the tired eyes and the older woman who looked like she had been crying for a year, and whatever she saw made her decide something. She refilled both cups to the brim, and she said, "Your meal is on me today." When Marin reached for her wallet anyway, Birdie put her hand flat over the bill on the counter and did not move it. "I said it is on me," Birdie said more gently. "You look like you have a hard road. A hot meal on a cold day is the smallest thing in the world. Let an old woman give you one." Marin felt something move in her chest that she had been holding shut for 8 months, something that pushed up against her throat, and she had to look down at her soup until it passed. She did not understand then why the kindness of a stranger could undo what the cruelty of a corporation could not. She would understand later. But for now, she only nodded and she ate, and she let herself be cared for, just for a moment, in a warm room 4 hours from everything she had lost. "Old Emmett," Birdie said quietly, wiping the counter, though it was already clean. "He was a hard one to know. Kept to himself up there for as long as anyone can remember. Did not trust the banks, did not trust the government, did not let a living soul up that road if he could help it." Then her hands went still on the rag, and she said something Marin would carry with her all the way up the mountain. "He told me once," Birdie said, "that everything he built up there, he built so the right person would find it." She did not explain what she meant. Marin did not ask. They finished their soup, and they thanked her, and they drove the last miles up a road that turned to dirt and then to ruts, and then washed out entirely, so that they had to leave the car and carry their suitcases the final quarter mile on foot, and then through the trees they saw it. The cabin stood in a small clearing the forest had been trying to take back for years. The porch had half collapsed. Ivy had crawled up one whole wall and into a broken window. The roof sagged worse than the photograph had shown. It smelled even from the yard of damp earth and old wood and the particular mildew of a building that had been sealed and abandoned and left to breathe its own decay. Inside, the floors were littered with the leavings of animals, and the walls were hung with wallpaper that peeled away in long yellow strips like old skin. Renata stood in the doorway and put her hand to her mouth. Marin put down the suitcases. She walked into the center of the largest room, the room with a great stone fireplace, at its heart river rock, laid by hand from floor to ceiling, and she turned slowly all the way around. She did not see the rot. She saw the frame standing square and true under all of it. She saw 100 years of life still possible in those walls. "We can do this," she said. "I can do this." And because she had nowhere else to be and nothing left to lose, she began. The first weeks were a blur of dust and sweat and aching hands. They had no money for contractors, which was just as well because Marin did not want strangers. She and her mother tore out the ruined wallpaper and the soft black drywall behind it, scrubbed the floors with bleach until the old wood came up, honey-colored beneath the filth, and patched the worst of the roof with tarp and tar against the coming cold. Without rent, without a mortgage, without the bottomless legal fees that had bled them dry in the city, the little money they had left stretched further than Marin had dared hope. A box of nails, a bundle of cedar shingles, a new pane of glass. Renata, for the first time in months, had something to do with her hands, and Marin watched the work do for her mother a small part of what it did for her. Some of the underwater look began to lift. Not all of it, but some. It was in the second week that Marin found the bird. She had pried up a loose board in the corner of the loft, meaning only to nail it back flat, and underneath it, tucked into the gap between the joists, where someone had hidden it deliberately, was a small object wrapped in oilcloth. She unwrapped it on her knees in the dim light. It was a bird carved from a single piece of pale wood no bigger than her palm. A chickadee, she thought, the little black cap of birds that flicked through the pines all around the cabin. It had been made by someone with patience and a sharp knife and no hurry at all. The feathers were suggested with tiny, careful strokes. The eyes were two pricks of dark. She turned it over. On the flat of its belly, scratched into the wood with the point of a blade, were 6 numbers. They were grouped, she saw, into 3 pairs, 041775. It looked like a date, the 17th of April perhaps, in the year 1975. She did not know whose date it might be. There was no name, no other mark, just a small carved bird and a date scratched into its underside by a man who had lived alone in these woods and trusted no one. She thought about leaving it where it was. Something stopped her. Instead, she carried it down to the main room and set it on the windowsill above the kitchen sink where the light came in, and she went back to work. Over the days that followed, she would catch herself looking at it, a grown man, a recluse who let no one near, who hid his cash from banks and his life from the world, had taken the time to carve a small, soft bird and scratch a date into it and hide it under the floor of his own house. It troubled her in a way she could not name. People do not hide what does not matter to them. She did not yet know how much it mattered. She would find out soon. It was in the 4th week, while she was measuring the main room for new baseboards, that the house first lied to her. She was running a tape along the inside wall, jotting the numbers in the small notebook she kept for material costs, the same kind of notebook she had filled with floor plans since she was 8 years old. And as she wrote the numbers down, something in the back of her mind, the part her father had trained, without either of them knowing, it began to itch. The numbers were wrong, not wrong like a mistake, wrong like a lie. She set down the tape and she sketched the cabin from above quickly, the way she always had. A simple rectangle, the main room, the kitchen along the back, the small bedroom beyond the fireplace. She wrote in the measurements she had just taken. Then she went outside into the cold and she measured the cabin from the outside foundation corner to foundation corner, walking it twice to be sure. She came back in and she sat down on an overturned bucket and she looked at the two sets of numbers for a long time. The outside of the cabin wall to wall was 38 feet long. The inside, when you added the main room and the kitchen and the bedroom together and allowed for the thickness of the walls, came to 29 feet. She checked it again. She checked it a third time on her hands and knees with the tape, certain she had made an error. She had not. There was no error. There was simply between the inside of that house and the outside of that house 9 feet of length that did not exist, 9 feet that the rooms did not account for, 9 feet of solid, hidden, unexplained space, and it was all in one place. It was all behind the fireplace. "Mom," she said. Her voice came out strange. "Come, look at this." Renata came wiping her hands, and Marin walked her through it. The two sets of numbers, the missing 9 feet, the great stone fireplace standing in the center of the house like a sealed mouth. Maybe it is just dead space, her mother offered. An old chimney is thick. Maybe it is nothing but stone. Marin walked to the fireplace. She pressed her ear to the cold river rock, and she rapped it with her knuckles hard, working her way across the face of it. The stone gave back a solid, dead sound. But a chimney, even a great one, is not 9 feet deep. A chimney is a flue and a firebox and the stone around them. 9 feet was a room. 9 feet was a space a man could stand up inside. And she remembered Bertie's words in the warm diner with the coffee going cold. He built everything up there so the right person would find it. "I need to see the basement," she said. They had been down once on the first day and never gone back. It was a cramped, unfinished cellar with a low ceiling and a floor of bare dirt, and it smelled of cold clay and faintly of sulfur, the smell of stone and old water, and there had been no reason to go down into the dark and the damp. There was a reason now. Marin took the heavy flashlight and went down the creaking wooden stairs, her mother close behind her, the beams swinging across cobwebs, and a dirt floor undisturbed for years. She walked to the center of the cellar, to the place that lay directly beneath the great stone fireplace above, and she pointed the light, and her mother made a small sound in the dark. Because the foundation of the cabin all the way around was poured concrete, gray and old and continuous, all the way around except for one place. Here, beneath the fireplace, rising from the dirt floor to the joists overhead, was a wall of gray cinder block. The mortar between the blocks was smeared and uneven, the work of a man in a hurry, the work of a man working alone. It was crude. It did not match. It had not been part of the house when the house was built. "He built this later," Marin whispered. She put her flat hand against the rough block and felt the cold come through it. He walled it off. He sealed it up with his own hands. She went back up the stairs without another word and came down with a sledgehammer they had bought to break up the rotten porch. "Marin," her mother said, "are you sure? What if it holds something up?" "It does not," Marin said. She had already looked. The floor joist ran straight past the cinder block wall, resting on the real foundation. The wall carried nothing. The wall was not built to hold the house up. The wall was built to keep something in. She set her feet. She swung the hammer back over her shoulder and brought it down into the center of the wall with everything she had. The block cracked. Dust bloomed into the beam of the flashlight. She swung again, harder, and a third time, and on the third blow, the center block shattered inward and tumbled away into a darkness on the far side, and out of the hole came a breath of air, cold, stale, decades old, and carrying on it a faint, sharp scent of metal and machine oil. She did not stop. She swung until her shoulders screamed, knocking the blocks out one by one, widening the hole, the rubble cascading into the void beyond, until at last There was an opening tall enough and wide enough to step through. She set down the hammer. She took up the flashlight. Her mother's hand found her arm and held it. Maren stepped through the wall. The space on the other side was a small room, perhaps 8 feet by 8 feet square, and dry, its floor poured concrete where the rest of the cellar was dirt. It sat directly beneath the great stone chimney above, and it had been built. First she understood at once the way Bertie's words had hinted. The man had not carried this into his basement. He had built his cabin around it, and set into the far wall of that little room, anchored into a frame of reinforced steel, was a door. It was a vault door, the kind you see in old photographs of banks, the kind they made in the 1930s, round and massive and gray, standing nearly 6 feet tall, fitted with a great spoked wheel, like the helm of a ship, and a single black combination dial at its center and a ring of heavy steel bolts around its edge. It must have weighed more than a ton. The sheer impossibility of it here in the cellar of a falling down cabin at the dead end of a washed out road in the deepest woods in New Hampshire struck the two women dumb. They stood in the dust and the flashlight beam and simply stared at it. How, her mother finally said, "How did he get this down here?" "He did not bring it down," Maren said softly, and she understood it as she said it. "The vault was here first. He built the room around the vault. He built the house around the room. Everything we have been standing in for 4 weeks, the whole cabin was just a shell to hide this." She stepped close. She put her hand on the great spoked wheel, the steel so cold it almost burned, and she pulled. It did not move, not a hair. The bolts held the door shut as they had held it shut for decades. She tried the dial. It spun smooth and silent under her fingers, well oiled even now, but it spun against nothing. Without the combination, the dial was only a wheel turning in the dark, and the door was a closed mouth that would not speak. For 2 days, the cabin stopped mattering. The baseboards, the roof, the floors, all of it stopped. Maren became a woman possessed by a single question. She drove to the end of the road and sat in the car where the phone caught one thin bar of signal and read everything she could find about old vaults. She learned that a door like this could not be forced without machines that cost more than she had, and that calling in a man who could crack it meant telling a stranger what was behind it. And she did not, by some instinct she could not explain, want a single stranger to know. She slept badly. She dreamed of the dial turning. And on the 3rd morning, washing her hands at the kitchen sink, she looked up at the windowsill into the light at the small carved bird she had set there weeks ago. She picked it up. She turned it over in her wet hands. She looked at the 6 numbers scratched into its belly by a man who hid his life from the world. 041775. A date, she had thought, a date that meant nothing to her, but it had meant something to him. It had meant enough that he carved it into a bird and hid the bird under his own floor, and it was the only set of numbers connected to this man's whole hidden life that she had ever found. She did not let herself hope. She walked down the stairs and through the broken wall into the little room with her heart going hard against her ribs, and she knelt before the great gray door, and she set the bird on the concrete beside her where she could read it, and she put her hand on the dial. 3 pairs, 3 numbers. She had read enough in 2 days to know how these doors work. Right to the first past 0 and around, left to the second, right to the third. She turned the dial slowly to 4. She turned it the other way around once and back to 17. She turned it again, the last way to 75. She held her breath. She took the spoked wheel in both hands, and she pulled. Somewhere deep inside the door, with a sound like a heavy chain falling slack, the bolts drew back. The wheel turned. The great door swung outward on its hinges with a long, low groan, the sound of a thing sealed for half a lifetime, opening at last, and the cold, stale breath of the inside rushed out over her, and Maren raised the flashlight and looked into the vault. It was lined with steel shelving. Against one wall stood a strange old radio, all dials and dead tubes, the kind a man might use to listen to the whole world while letting none of it near him. But it was the heavy wooden desk in the center of the little chamber that stopped her breath. On its surface, stacked in neat banded bricks and wrapped in clouded plastic, was money, cash, $100 bills, more of them than Marin had ever seen or imagined, stacked into a low wall of currency that the beam of her flashlight crawled across without finding the end of. She did not touch it. Some part of her already knew the way you know a thing is too hot before your hand reaches it, that this money was not a gift and not a windfall. Money does not get sealed behind a ton of steel and a wall of cinder block by an innocent man. And beside the money, stacked in 2 tall columns on the old desk, were books, ledgers, dozens of them bound in cracked leather, their spines stiff with age, and lying flat across the top of the nearest stack, yellow with the years, was a single folded page. Her name was not on it. No name was on it. Just one line written in a careful, old-fashioned hand. To whoever the house chooses. Marin sat down slowly on the cold concrete floor. She set the flashlight on the desk so it threw its light up against the steel ceiling and filled the little room with a pale, even glow. And with hands that would not quite stop shaking, she unfolded the page and began to read. If you are reading this, the letter began, then you found the worst thing I ever did and the only thing I ever got right. My name for 50 years has been Emmett Vale. It was not always my name. I came to these woods to disappear, and I did more completely than you can know. I built this cabin with my own hands, and I built it around a thing I could not throw away and could not keep in the light. The money in front of you is real, $2 million near enough, and it is poison. It is not clean, and it never was. There are men who would kill for it and men who would arrest you for it, and there is no spending it that does not end with you in a cell or a grave. I know because I have spent 50 years not spending it. I leave it to you not as a fortune, but as a warning. Do not love it. It cannot love you back. What I leave you that matters is in the books beside it. Everything I did, I wrote down. Every name, every dollar, every house. I kept the books to protect myself in the beginning. I kept them at the end because a man should not be allowed to die with the truth still hidden inside him. If you have the courage, those books can undo a great deal of harm. If you do not burn them, and I will not blame you because I know exactly how heavy the truth is to carry. Here the careful hand wavered just once, the only place in the whole page where it did. I had a child, the letter said, a girl. I left her when she was 6 years old to keep her safe from the life I had chosen, and I never saw her again, and not seeing her was the price I paid and the punishment I deserved. I have no way to give her what I owe, so I will say to you what I could never say to her. A house that no one can ever put you out of is the only fortune that ever mattered. I spent my life hiding money for men who loved it more than their own children. I am leaving it where it can finally do the one thing money is good for, which is to let someone stay. I am sorry I learned this too late. I hope it sets you free. It was signed at the bottom in the same careful hand, Emmett Vale, and below the name a date. Marin read it twice. Then she sat for a long while in the pale light, the small carved bird in her hand, the words a child and a girl, and never saw her again, moving through her like cold water, thinking of her own father, who had also paid with his life for the things other men had decided, and of her mother upstairs, who had loved one man her whole life and lost him. She thought she finally understood why Bertie's kindness had undone her in the diner. The cruel asks nothing of you. It is only the ones who give, the ones who hand you a hot meal or carve a small bird or leave you a door full of truth who can break your heart wide open. She set down the letter. She reached for the topmost ledger, the most recent looking of them all, its leather, least cracked meaning to understand what this dead man wanted her to carry. She opened it across her knees and ran the flashlight down the columns of names and numbers in his careful hand, the record of every house he had ever helped to hide, dozens of them, an entire secret city of stolen addresses. And then her flashlight stopped moving, because there near the bottom of a page, written in the dead man's hand among all the others, was a name she knew, a name she had read on a notice taped to a door in the rain, a name with a corporate address and a man in an expensive coat behind it, a name that had cost her father his life and put her family on the street. The name in the dead man's book was Meridian Harbor Holdings, in a dead man's handwriting, in a leather book that had been sealed behind a ton of steel for half a lifetime. The name that had killed her father. Maren did not move, could not. The flashlight shook in her hand and threw the name back and forth across the page as if the light itself could not believe it either. She read it again, because the mind does that. It refuses. It says no. It says you are tired, you are seeing things, you have been down in this cold hole too long, and your eyes are playing tricks, and that is not the name. It cannot be the name. It is some other name that only looks the same in the dark, except it was the name. There was a margin note beside it, cramped, inked years apart in two different shades, as if the dead man had come back to the same line again and again over decades to keep it current. And in that margin, in the careful old-fashioned hand, was an address, their address, the building in New Bedford, 3rd floor, the door with the rain-swollen notice, the 9 years, the kitchen where her father had pressed his hand to his chest, that address, written in the book of a man who had died alone in the woods before Maren was even born. She made a sound, not a word, something lower than a word. Up through the broken cinder wall, up the cellar stairs, her mother's voice came down thin and worried. Maren, what is it? Maren, you are scaring me. And Maren wanted to call back, it is nothing, come look at this, the way she had 4 weeks ago when the house first lied to her about 9 feet. But this was not 9 feet. This was the whole shape of her life bending into a circle she did not understand yet. So she did not answer. She sat on the cold concrete with $2 million of poison at her elbow and a dead man's confession in her lap, and she began page by page to learn who Emmett Vale had really been. It took her the rest of that night. It took her, in truth, 3 days. 3 days in which the cabin stopped mattering again. The roof, the baseboards, the cedar shingles drying in a stack on the porch, all of it went still. Renata brought her coffee down into the cold little room and did not understand and was too frightened to ask, and Maren sat cross-legged on the floor with the ledgers fanned out around her like the petals of some terrible flower, and she read. She was good at this. That was the thing. That was the awful gift of it, because a girl who had drawn floor plans since she was 8 years old, who had spent 2 summers crawling through the guts of old houses, learning how a structure carried its own weight, did not read a ledger the way other people read one. She read it the way she read a building. She looked for the bones. She looked for the load path. She looked for the one beam that held the whole thing up, and the ledgers had bones. Emmett Vale had been a bookkeeper, not the kind who works at a desk in the daylight, the kind who works in back rooms, the kind whose books are never meant to be found. In a careful, patient, unhurried hand, the same hand that had carved a small bird, he had recorded every dirty dollar he ever moved, and he had moved a great many for men whose names sat at the top of his charts like the keystones of an arch. The biggest name, the one all the others hung from, was Aldo Ferrante. Maren did not know the name. She would learn it. The Ferrante organization had run a corner of the old city for 30 years back when the harbor was busy and the mills still turned, and Aldo Ferrante had been the man behind the man, the underboss, the one who never got his picture in the paper because his whole genius was in not being seen. He did not hide his money in mattresses. He was smarter than that. He laundered it. He washed it clean through buildings, apartment buildings, whole blocks. He bought them through companies that owned other companies, a labyrinth so deep that no one could ever say who really held the keys. And the man who built that labyrinth, the man who drew every shell and named every front and kept the only true map of where all the dirty money slept, was Emmett Vale. Marin turned the pages, the organization charts, the columns of properties, the shell companies branching and rebranching down the years like a family tree of lies, and she watched with a cold and rising horror as the dead man tracked his own monster forward through time, because that was the strangest part of all. Emmett had not stopped writing when he ran. He had kept the books current. Up here alone, paranoid, with no one to share it with, he had obsessively followed the children of his shell companies as they changed names and merged and were sold and renamed again, decade after decade, the way an old man might trace the descendants of someone he had wronged. One shell became two became a holding company. The holding company was bought in the 1990s and renamed again after that, cleaned up, polished, sold to people who wore good coats and had no idea or pretended to have no idea what the foundation was built on, until the whole long, crooked line came down in the most recent ledger in ink that was only a few years old to a single name at the bottom of the page: Meridian Harbor Holdings. This is the part where Marin stopped lying to herself, because she had been telling herself a story for 3 days. The story was, this is a coincidence. The story was, the name is common. Lots of companies have harbor in them. This is a small world. This means nothing. And the story was a comfort, and the story was a wall. And on the third day, the wall came down, and what was behind it was so simple and so terrible that she laughed out loud once alone in a dead man's cellar, the way you laugh when something is too cruel to cry at. The company that evicted her family, the company that filed the false renovation papers, the company that ground her father down through 3 months of hearings until his heart gave out, the company with the man in the expensive coat, Meridian Harbor Holdings, was the great-great-grandchild of Aldo Ferrante's dirty money. The same buildings, the same machine painted a new color and handed down, the years still doing the only thing it had ever done, which was to take the homes of working people and turn them into profit for men who would never know their names. She had not stumbled onto a dead man's secret. She had stumbled onto her own. The eviction and the cabin were not 2 stories. They were 1 story bent into a ring, and she was standing in the place where the 2 ends met. She climbed the stairs that night, and she told her mother. Renata did not believe her. Then she did. Marin watched it happen across her mother's face, the way you watch weather come over a field. Disbelief, then the slow dawning, then a kind of fury Marin had not seen in her mother in 8 months, a clean, hot fury that was, she understood, so much healthier than the gray underwater grief it was burning away. This man, Renata said, her voice was shaking, this dead man up here, he knew the whole time what they were. He knew, Marin said, and he did nothing. He kept the book, Marin said. She did not know yet why that mattered. She would soon. But there were more books than the ledgers. She found them on the 4th day, not in the vault, in the cabin itself, behind a loose stone in the great river rock fireplace, set low at the height a man might reach while sitting in a chair beside the fire on a winter night. A flat tin box, the kind that once held biscuits, its lid rusted nearly shut. She had to work it with a knife, and when it finally gave, what was inside was not money and was not ledgers. It was letters. Dozens of them, folded, yellowed, tied in bundles with string gone soft and gray with age, and every single one of them began the same way. Dear Seraphina. Marin sat down on the cold hearth with the tin in her lap, and she read the first one, and within 3 lines she understood that she was holding the broken heart of a man who had been dead for 2 years, and within a page she was crying, and she did not stop, because they were birthday letters. He had written one every year on the same day, the 17th of April, for decades, a man alone in the woods who let no one near, who trusted no bank and no government and no living soul, had sat down beside his fire every year on his daughter's birthday and written her a letter, and he had never sent a single one. The first was dated the year after he vanished. She would be 7 now, it said. I made her a bird, a chickadee, because she loved the little ones that came to the window, and I have hidden it where no one will find it, because I cannot send it, because to send it is to tell them where I am, and to tell them where I am is to bring them to her. So I will keep it, and I will keep her safe the only way I have left, which is to stay away. The bird, the small carved bird on the kitchen windowsill, the bird whose belly held the numbers that had opened the vault, 041775, the 17th of April, 1975. Not a date that meant nothing, the most important date in a dead man's life, his daughter's birthday. He had locked the worst thing he ever did behind the one number he could never forget and could never bear to remember. Maren had to put the letter down. She had to press both hands over her mouth, because the cruelty of it, the terrible tenderness of it, a man who had hidden $2 million and the secret of a criminal empire behind a little girl's birthday. In the later letters, his real name began to surface the way a thing buried in a river works its way up over the years. He could not stop being who he had been. He needed at the end for someone to know. And so in a letter dated when Serafina would have been grown, married, perhaps with children of her own, that he would never meet, he wrote it down at last. My name was Vittorio Sabatini, he wrote. Before I was Emmett Vale, I was Vittorio Sabatini, and I was the cleanest dirty man in the city, because I never carried a gun, and I never raised my voice, and I made more money disappear than any soldier ever made bleed. I told myself I was only a bookkeeper. I told myself the houses were only houses, until the day I understood that every dollar I washed clean was a family somewhere put out into the street, so the number in a ledger could grow. And by the day I understood it, I was already a man they could not let leave. So I did not ask to leave. I took the books. I took enough of their money to make them hunt me forever, and I disappeared, and I have spent every year since, hidden in these trees, watching the machine I built grind on without me, unable to stop it, unable to forgive myself for starting it. I tell you this, the letter said, because you are the only person I have ever told the truth to, and you will never read this, and that is the only reason I can write it. There was a knock at the cabin door. Maren's heart slammed once hard against her ribs, because it was past dark, because no one came up that road, because the road was washed out and the nearest soul was 800 people and 20 miles away, because the only knock she had heard in 5 weeks was the wind. It was not the wind. She opened the door with the tin of letters still pressed to her chest, and on the broken porch stood a tiny, ancient woman in a man's wool coat, leaning on a cane with a flashlight in one hand and a covered dish in the other, and a face as wrinkled and kind as a walnut. I am Opal, the old woman said. I knew you would have found things by now. I came to tell you about him before the stories find you first. Her name was Opal, and she was 84 years old, and she had lived in these woods her whole life, and she had been, she said, as close to a friend as Emmett Vale ever let a person be, which was not close, but it was something. She came in out of the cold, and she set her dish on the table, a chicken pie still warm under a cloth, and she would not hear of being thanked for it, and Maren thought of Bertie at the diner, and understood that she had wandered into a country of women who fed strangers as a form of prayer. Opal sat by the cold fireplace, and she talked, and Maren and Renata listened, and the old woman gave them the other half of the dead man, the half the ledgers could never hold. He was not kind, Opal said. I will not lie and say he was. He was a hard-closed, frightened man, and he kept the world at the end of a long pole. But she stopped. Her old hands worked on the head of her cane. But every winter, she said, the hard winters, when the snow came early and the old folks on the back roads could not get out to cut wood, there would be wood on the porch, stacked neat before the first storm. Nobody saw him do it. Nobody ever caught him. He never knocked. He never wanted a word of thanks. He would have hated the thanks. It would have shamed him. But the wood was there every year for 30 years, and nobody on this mountain ever froze in the winters. Emmett Vale was alive. Renata had begun quietly to cry. Opal looked at her. The old woman had buried a husband too. You could see it on her, the same long practice of loss. And she reached across and put her wrinkled hand over Renata's, the way Bertie had put her hand over the bill. He spent his whole life, Opal said, paying for something none of us ever knew about. And I always thought whatever it was, a man does not leave firewood on a stranger's porch for 30 years if there is nothing good left in him. There was something good left in him. It just had nowhere to go. Then she looked at Marin, at the tin of letters in the girl's lap. He would be proud. Opal said that someone good found it, and there it was, the thing the dead man had wanted and could never have. A witness, someone to know he had tried. Opal stayed an hour, and then her grandson came up the road on a quad to fetch her, and before she went, she squeezed Marin's hand and said, "You will know what to do with it." He chose this house for someone who would. And then she was gone into the dark, and the cabin was quiet, and Renata wiped her eyes and looked at her daughter across the cold hearth and said the first whole sentence of hope she had said in 8 months. "We are going to use it," she said. "Whatever is in those books, we are going to use it for the ones who came after us." The next morning, a man named Wendell came to fix the chimney flashing. He had heard, in the way small towns hear everything, that a girl was up at Vale's place trying to put a roof back on alone, and Wendell was 70 and a stonemason and a carpenter, and he could not abide the thought of it. So he came up with a truck full of tools, and he climbed onto the roof with a girl a third his age, and he taught her over 2 cold days how to set flashing into stone so the water would run off and not in. He showed her how to point old mortar, how to read which stones were sound and which were only pretending. He would not take $1. A man your father's age, he said, when she pressed the money on him, would not let a young woman pay him to teach her something he learned for free from somebody who would not take his money either. That is how it works up here. You will pass it on. That is the only payment there is. And Marin, on the roof of a dead man's house, learning to make a thing watertight from a stranger who asked for nothing, felt the cabin become stone by stone the first thing in her life that no one could ever take from her, until she came down off the roof on the second evening and saw the footprints. They were in the soft mud below the cellar window, the little window low at the foundation, the one that looked into the dark where the vault stood. And the footprints were not hers, and were not Wendell's, and were not her mother's. They were a man's, large, new, and the window, the cellar window. There were scratches on the old painted frame, bright, raw, where a blade or a bar had worked at the latch from the outside. Marin stood very still in the dusk, with her heart going like a hammer. Someone had been here. Someone had come up the washed-out road in the dark while she was on the roof, and had crouched at her foundation and had tried to get in. "Mom," she said, going inside, keeping her voice level, the way you keep your voice level when you do not want a frightened person to break. "Mom, we have to talk." Renata took one look at her daughter's face and said, "Who was it?" "I do not know," Marin said, but she did know. In the part of her that had laughed alone in the cellar, she knew. There was only one set of people on this earth who would want what was in that vault, and only one of them wore an expensive coat and had her old address on file. She did not sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table with the bird in one hand and the tin of letters at her elbow, and she thought and thinking she understood the trap she was in, because she could not go to the local sheriff. A town of 800 people and a single deputy was not built to handle 2 million in laundered cash and the secret architecture of a criminal empire. And she could not simply hand the books to anyone, because the moment she did, she lost the only thing she had, which was that they did not know. Meridian did not know exactly what she had, or where it was, or how much the dead man had written down. The books were a weapon only as long as they were hidden and whole. So she needed two things. She needed someone who knew the law from the inside, and she needed to get the books off this mountain tonight, before whoever had crouched at her window came back with more than a blade. She found his name at the end of the road, in the one thin bar of signal hunched over her phone in the cold car at 2 in the morning. A lawyer in Concord, a former federal prosecutor who had spent 20 years putting away exactly this kind of a man, and now in private practice was known for one thing above all others. He hated developers. He hated the men who hid behind shell companies and renovation loopholes the way some men hate snakes, with a loathing that was almost personal. His name was Lorne Decker. She did not call. You do not call at 2 in the morning. She wrote down the address. Then she did the hardest thing she had done since she folded the eviction notice in the rain. She packed the ledgers into a waterproof duffel, all of them, and the tin of letters, and one single bundle of the cash, one brick of the poison, because Decker would need to see it was real. She left the rest of the money sealed in the vault, and she swung the great gray door shut and spun the dial, and the bolts drove home with that sound like a chain falling, and the worst thing the dead man ever did went back into the dark. Her mother stood in the doorway in the dark in her nightgown. "Let me come," Renata said. "No," Marin said, and then softer because she saw the fear and the love tangled in her mother's face. "No, if they come back, someone has to be here who knows nothing, who has nothing. You do not even know where I have gone. Do you understand? You are safer not knowing." Renata understood. That was the terrible thing. She understood, and she let her 21-year-old daughter carry a dead launderer's confession out into the night alone, because there was no one else, because the man who would have done it was 8 months in the ground, and the knowing had fallen to Marin the day the notice went up on the door. "You are so much like him," Renata said. "Your father." Marin could not answer that. If she answered that, she would not be able to leave. So she kissed her mother, and she carried the duffel down the dark path to the car, and she drove 3 hours, south and east down, out of the great trees, the road climbing into her headlights mile after mile, the rain starting somewhere past midnight and falling steady the rest of the way. She gripped the wheel. She watched the mirror. She told herself the headlights 2 turns back were nothing, were a logging truck, were anyone, and she watched them anyway until they fell away at a junction, and her heart slowed. And as she drove, she thought about why she was doing it, because here is what it was not. It was not revenge. She turned the word over and put it down. Revenge was a small thing and a hot thing, and it burned out fast. And what she felt was not small and was not hot. It was cold, and it was wide, and it would not go away. It was the address in the margin. It was the renovation clause. It was her father's hand on his chest. And underneath all of it, it was a number she had found written in the most recent ledger, a number she could not stop seeing, because Emmett Vale had counted in his obsessive watching the buildings Meridian still held, and in the margins he had tallied something else. The families, the ones put out in the last 3 years alone by the company her family had been put out by. 41 of them when he made the count. 41 families, and then her own. which made 42, 42 families like hers, like the one her father died inside of. She was not doing this to hurt Pierce Maddox. She was doing this because she had read the truth, and you cannot unread the truth, and a person who knows where 42 doors of harm come from and does nothing becomes in some small way the dead man in the woods, leaving firewood, paying forever, unable to stop the machine she could have stopped. So she would stop it, not for herself, for the 42, and for the one she had buried in October. The city came up gray and wet in the first light, conquered, the gold dome of the State House shining dull in the rain. She found the address, an old brick building, a brass plate. She had not slept. She did not care. She carried the duffel up a narrow stair, and she knocked, and after a long moment, the door opened on a heavy-set man in his 60s with a gray stubbled face and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the wary, tired, intelligent eyes of a man who had heard 10,000 stories and believed almost none of them. Lauren Decker looked at the girl on his step, soaked, hollow-eyed, 21 if she was a day. "We are not open," he said. "Office hours are at 9. I did not come during office hours," Marin said on purpose. Something in how she said it made him pause with his hand on the door. She did not explain. She did not plead. She had learned somewhere in the last week that you do not waste words on a man like this. So she crouched right there on his threshold, and she unzipped the duffel, and she took out one thing, the single brick of cash, the poison, and she set it on the floor between them in its clouded plastic, banded and old. Decker looked at it. He did not touch it, but his eyes changed. He had spent 20 years as a federal prosecutor, and he knew banded cash when he saw it, and he knew the way a doctor knows a shadow on a film, that this was not ordinary money. "Tell me," he said slowly, "that you did not rob a bank." "I did not," Marin said. Then where Decker said, "In the name of God, did a girl your age get that?" And Marin, kneeling in his doorway in the rain soaked to the bone, with a dead man's confession in a duffel bag, and her father 8 months in the ground, and 42 strangers depending on what she did next, looked up at him and said the truest sentence she had. "I bought a house," she said, "and a dead man had been waiting 50 years for someone to find what was under it." Decker stood very still. The rain came down behind her on the street, and then the former prosecutor stepped back from his own door and held it open and said the words that would bring the whole machine down. "You had better come in," he said, "and you had better start at the beginning." Lauren Decker did not sleep for the next 2 days either. He read the ledgers the way Marin had read them, at his kitchen table, in his reading glasses, with a glass of something amber going warm and untouched at his elbow. And somewhere in the first hour, he stopped being a tired private lawyer who had heard 10,000 stories and started being the federal prosecutor he had been for 20 years, the one who put men in cages, the one who never raised his voice because he never had to. He looked up at her once around 3 in the morning, his face gray. "Do you understand what this is?" he said. "It is the truth," Marin said. "It is a bomb," Decker said. "With your fingerprints on the pin." He made calls, old calls, to people he had not spoken to in years. A former colleague now high up in the Department of Justice, the kind of woman who answered her own phone at 6 in the morning because she had never in her life stopped working. A federal investigator with a quiet voice and a careful manner who came to Decker's office in an ordinary coat and looked at the single brick of cash for a long time before he said one word. "This is not drug money," the investigator said finally. "This is laundered money. Old, washed clean, and then somehow gone dirty again." He looked at Marin. "Where is the rest of it?" "Somewhere safe," Marin said. "How much?" "About 2 million. The investigator did not blink, but something in his stillness changed the way a pawn changes when something large moves under it. "And the books," he said. Marin put her hand flat on the duffel. "The books," she said, "are the whole machine. Every name, every house, 50 years of it, tracked all the way down to a company called Meridian Harbor Holdings. The investigator went very still at that name, and Marin understood that he knew it, that everyone in a certain world knew it. A respectable company, a clean company, a company with good lawyers and a charity gala, and a man in an expensive coat. And she said the thing that made the room go cold. The company that evicted my family, she said, is the same dirty money that this dead man washed for the Ferrante organization 50 years ago. It never went clean. It just changed its clothes. The investigator looked at Decker. Decker looked at the investigator. And in that look, a thing passed between two men who had spent their lives chasing exactly this and almost never catching it. The look of hunters who have just been handed the animal. Then Decker turned to Marin and he told her how it would work. The federal whistleblower laws, the way the government, when it seizes assets built on fraud and laundering, pays the private citizen who hands them the evidence a share of what is recovered. He did not name a number. He said, if this is what it looks like and they seize what Meridian holds, you are looking at more money than your family has ever seen. Clean money, legal money, money no man in a coat can ever take back. And Marin, who had not slept in 4 days, who had carried a dead man's confession down off a mountain in the dark, heard the word money and felt almost nothing because she had read a letter from a man who spent 50 years not spending $2 million. She had learned what he had learned. Money cannot love you back. So she nodded and she said, only what do we do first? We move carefully, Decker said. We do not tip them. We build it quiet. We get the books authenticated. We get a federal seizure order ready before Meridian ever knows the ground is moving under them. That was the plan. Except Pierce Maddox moved first. Because here is the thing Marin had not understood about men in expensive coats. They are not slow. They are not stupid. And they have people. Her former lawyer, the decent one from the eviction, got a call, a polite call, from a man at Meridian asking almost idly about a former tenant, the Tavares girl. Did the firm know where the family had relocated? Just tidying up the file, just closing the loop. And the lawyer, who was decent, but who was also afraid, said the word New Hampshire. It was enough. Marin was back at the cabin when it came. 3 days back, helping Wendell set the last of the new shingles, her mother below, in the yard hanging wash in the cold sun, the first ordinary morning in weeks, and a car came up the washed-out road. Not a logging truck, a black car that did not belong, that had no business on a road that ended at a dead man's cabin, and it stopped at the washout, and a man got out. Not Maddox, a man who worked for Maddox, in a good coat, with an envelope. He did not come up to the house. He set the envelope on a fence post at the edge of the property where Marin could see it, and he looked up the hill at her on the roof for a long moment, so she would know he had seen her, so she would know they knew exactly where she was. And then he got back in the car and drove away. Marin came down off the roof slowly. The envelope held 2 things. The first was a legal filing, an emergency petition. Meridian Harbor Holdings was moving in court to void the tax sale of the Vale property, claiming a defect in the auction, claiming the estate had been improperly seized, claiming in language so smooth it took Marin 3 readings to feel the knife inside it, that any contents found on the property belonged not to the buyer, but to the estate, and through the estate, through the long, crooked chain to them. They were not just trying to take the cabin back. They were trying to take the books. The second thing in the envelope was not legal at all. It was a single photograph of her mother, hanging wash in the yard, taken that morning, from the trees. Marin's hands began to shake and she made them stop, because this was the part the dead man's letter had warned her about. There are men who would kill for it, he had written. And here was the proof on a fence post, a photograph of her mother, and a court filing in the same envelope, the soft threat and the hard one wrapped together, the message unmistakable. Give us the books, or we take the house the law. and we are watching the people you love the photograph. This was the darkest hour. She would think so later looking back. Not the eviction, not even her father. This, standing in the yard of the one thing she owned in the world, with a picture of her mother in her hand and a machine 50 years old turning toward her with all its weight. She called Decker from the end of the road, the one thin bar, the cold car. "They know," she said. Her voice was not level now. "They filed to take the cabin and the books, and they took a picture of my mother." There was a silence on the line. Then Decker said in a voice she had not heard from him, a voice without any of the dry tiredness in it, a voice that was simply coldly furious. "Get your mother. Get the books. Get in the car. Come to me. Now." And one more thing he said before she hung up. They just made the worst mistake of their lives, because a man who files a court petition has to put his name on it, and the moment Pierce Maddox put his name on a piece of paper claiming those contents, he tied himself in writing to a vault full of laundered money and a 50-year-old crime. He just signed his own confession. He does not know it yet, but he did. She drove through the night again, her mother in the passenger seat this time, the duffel of books between them, Renata white-knuckled and silent, watching the mirror, and Maren did not tell her about the photograph, would not put that in her mother's hands. But Renata was not a fool, and she had seen the envelope, and she knew, and somewhere in the dark hours, her mother reached over and put her hand on her daughter's arm and left it there, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing to say that the hand did not already say. In Concord, Decker had been busy, because while Maddox was filing his clever petition, Decker had been pulling a thread, the lineage thread. He had asked himself the question a good prosecutor always asks, which is not what but who. Who was Pierce Maddox? Not the coat, not the company, the man. Where had he come from? And the answer, when Decker found it, was the last terrible turn of the whole circle. He laid it out for Maren in his office at dawn. 2 photographs side by side, an old one and a new one. The old one was a grainy surveillance photo from 50 years ago, a man in a hat outside a social club, one of Aldo Ferrante's men, not a soldier, not a button man, a money man, the one who carried the cash to be washed, Ferrante's bag man, and his name written in Emmett Vale's careful hand in a ledger from the early 1970s was right there on the page Decker had marked. The new photograph was Pierce Maddox. The bagman, Decker said quietly, was Pierce Maddox's grandfather. Maren stared at the 2 faces, the old man in the hat, the young man in the coat, and the space of 50 years between them where the whole thing had happened, the laundering, the disappearance, the cleaning up, the going corporate, the polish, the charity galas, the renovation clauses, the families put out into the street, one generation after another. It never ended, she said. It just changed hands. Grandfather to son to him. It is the family business, Decker said. It always was. They just stopped calling it what it is. And Maren understood then the true shape of what she was doing. She was not fighting one greedy man. She was standing at the end of a chain of harm that ran back 3 generations. Dirty money passed down like an heirloom, doing the same thing in every generation, taking homes, and she had it in her power to do the one thing no one in 50 years had been able to do. She could break it, not avenge it. Break it, cut the chain, so that the grandfather's crime and the son's silence and the grandson's coat all came down at once in the daylight in a courtroom with their names on it. The dead man in the woods had kept the books because a man should not die with the truth still hidden inside him. Maren finally understood the rest of that sentence. He had kept them so that someone someday could carry the truth out into the light and let it do what only the truth can do, which is to end things. The hearing was on a cold, bright Thursday. Maddox came in like a man who had already won, because in his world he had the good lawyers and the smooth filing, and the law on the surface of his side, and he sat at his table in his expensive coat with the small private smile of a man who has spent his whole life watching working people lose, and he did not even look at the girl across the room. Why would he? She was furniture. She was a tenant. She was nothing. Marin sat beside Decker in a borrowed blazer, her mother's blazer, the only good thing either of them owned, her hair pulled back, her hands folded, her father's somewhere in her chest. And she watched Pierce Maddox not look at her, and she thought, you do not even know. You walked in here to take a cabin, and you are about to lose an empire because you did not know whose house you tried to take. Maddox's lawyer spoke first, smooth, confident. The defect in the auction, the improper seizure, the contents belonging to the estate. He spoke for 10 minutes and made it sound like the most reasonable thing in the world, made the girl in the blazer sound like an opportunist, made 42 families sound like a clerical matter. Then Lorne Decker stood up, and the room changed, because he did not argue about the auction. He did not argue about defects. He let all of that lie there, the clever surface argument untouched, and he reached down and he laid a single book on the table, a cracked leather ledger, and he said very quietly in the voice that never had to rise, "My client agrees that the contents of the property are relevant to this petition," Decker said. "In fact, they are central to it. So let us look at the contents the petitioner is so eager to claim." He opened the book, and he began to read names. He read the chain out loud in the silent courtroom. He read it the way Marin had first read it on a cellar floor, link by link, shell to shell, decade to decade, the labyrinth a dead man had drawn and tracked his whole life. Aldo Ferrante at the top, the properties, the companies, the renaming and the merging and the cleaning, down and down, 50 years of it, until he came to the name at the bottom of the page, Meridian Harbor Holdings. Then Decker turned to the marked page with the old photograph clipped to it, and he read one more name, the bagman, the man in the hat, and he said this man carried the money, and this man, he said, looking at the petitioner's table for the first time, was Pierce Maddox's grandfather. The small private smile was gone from Maddox's face. He had gone the color of paper, because he understood it now all at once, the trap he had built with his own hands. He had come to court to claim those contents. He had put his name on it, and the contents were a 50-year-old crime that ran straight through his own blood and into his own company, and by claiming them, by signing for them, he had hung the whole thing around his own neck in front of a federal judge. "Where did you get this?" Maddox said. He said it low. He said it the way a man says a thing when the floor has gone out from under him. "Where did you get this?" Marin had been told she would not need to speak. Decker had told her, "Sit, be still, let me do this." But the dead man's voice was in her, and her father's heart was in her, and 42 families were behind her. And when Pierce Maddox finally turned and looked at her across that courtroom, looked at her for the first time as if she were a person and not furniture, she stood up. "A man left it for me," she said. Her voice did not shake. "A man who spent his whole life hiding what your family was, and then spent 50 years sorry that he did. He kept the truth because he could not carry it to his grave. He left it to me, and I am not going to carry it to mine either." She let that sit. The whole room quiet. "My family," she said, "paid our rent on time for 9 years, in a building your grandfather's money built. My father died fighting you for it. So before you ask me again where I got it," she said, "you should think about that, all of it, right now, because this is the last room you are going to be a free man in." The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. They did not open on men with guns. There was no raid, no shouting. It was quieter than that, and somehow worse for Maddox because of it. 2 people came in, the federal investigator in his ordinary coat, and a woman from the Department of Justice with a folder under her arm, and the calm of someone who has already won. They walked up the aisle, and the investigator stopped beside Pierce Maddox's chair and said something to him in a low voice and put a hand on his shoulder almost gently, the way you might steady someone who is about to fall. And Pierce Maddox, who had walked in to take a cabin, sat in his expensive coat and watched his whole life come down and did not say a single word because there were no words left, because the truth had finally come out into the daylight, and there is nothing a man can say to the truth. What came after was history, not the loud kind, the slow grinding kind. The federal task force moved on Meridian Harbor Holdings and froze a portfolio worth a great deal more than Marin ever let herself picture. Dozens of buildings, an empire of laundered homes, the assets locked up, while the government unwound 50 years of lies. The $2 million in the vault was recovered, photographed, carried up out of the cellar, and cases returned to the government. A 50-year-old cold case finally and quietly closed. Pierce Maddox was charged. So were others. The man in the hat from the surveillance photo was long dead, but his crime was not, and the law has a long memory when someone finally hands it the book. And because Marin Tavares had walked a dead man's confession out of the woods and into the daylight, the government did the thing the law allows. They paid her a federal whistleblower award, a share of what was recovered, clean money, legal money, more money than her family had ever dreamed of. She gave most of it away. She did not even have to think about it, because she had read the letter. She knew what money was and what it was not. She had watched it kill her father, and she had watched a man hide from it for 50 years in the trees, and she had decided somewhere on a cellar floor that if she ever held that much of it, she would make it do the one thing the dead man said money was good for, which is to let someone stay. So she founded a thing, with Decker's help and her mother's and a lawyer's office full of work, a fund to pay for lawyers for tenants who were being put out the way her family had been put out, to buy buildings and keep them affordable so that no man in a coat could ever file a renovation clause and throw a family into the street, to fight with money the exact machine the money had come from. She named it the Vale and Serafina Fund because there was one thing left to do, one thing she had carried since the night she opened a rusted biscuit tin on a cold hearth and read the words, "Dear Serafina." The man had written 50 years of birthday letters to a daughter and never sent one, and Marin was not going to let them sit in a tin forever the way the firewood had sat on porches given by a man too ashamed to knock. She found her. It took months. Decker knew people who knew how, and one afternoon in early spring, in a small kitchen in a town 2 states away, Marin sat across a table from a woman in her 50s with kind, tired eyes who had grown up believing her father had abandoned her without a backward look, who had spent her whole life with that stone in her chest, whose name was Serafina. Marin did not say much. She had learned by then that you do not waste words on the things that matter most. She set 3 things on the table: the carved bird, the chickadee pale and small, made by a man with a sharp knife and no hurry at all, the tin of letters, 50 years of them, one for every birthday he had missed. And one more thing, a letter of her own from the fund, because the law had recovered restitution, and some of it was owed by every right to the only living blood the dead man had, money, clean money, her father's in the end, the one inheritance he had not been able to give her in life. Serafina did not touch any of it for a long time. She looked at the bird, and Marin watched a thing happen across the woman's face that she had watched once before, across her own mother's face, the slow turning of weather over a field, and Serafina picked up the bird and turned it over and read the date scratched into its belly, her own birthday, the 17th of April, 1975. "He made this for my 7th birthday," Marin said softly. "He could not send it. He thought it would lead them to you. He hid it under the floor of his own house, and he locked everything he was most afraid of behind that number, your birthday, because it was the only thing in his whole life he was never able to forget. Serafina began to cry, the way you cry for 50 years all at once. He did not leave you because he did not love you, Marin said. She was crying too now, both of them in a small kitchen, two strangers and a dead man between them. He left you because he did. It was the only way he knew to keep you safe from what he was. He was wrong, but he was not cold. He thought about you every single year. He wrote it down. He just never knew how to knock. Too. And Serafina, holding the small wooden bird her father had carved before she could remember, said the only thing there was to say. I forgive him, she said. Tell him, wherever he is, I forgive him. Marin drove home that night through the dark, and for the first time in a year, she was not afraid and she was not running, and the mirror behind her was empty, and the road in front of her led to a house no one could ever take. Her mother was waiting on the porch. The cabin was finished now. The roof Wendell had taught her to make was tight and true. The floors were honey-colored under lamplight. There were flowers in the yard where the ivy had been, and smoke from a chimney that drew clean, and a light in the window that said to anyone coming up the road, someone lives here, someone stays here. This is a home. Renata stood on the porch in the spring evening, and she was not underwater anymore. That was the thing Marin saw first, every time, the thing that mattered more than the money or the courtroom or any of it. Her mother had come back, slowly, over the months. The grief had not gone. Grief does not go, but it had stopped drowning her because she had something to do with her hands again, and a daughter beside her, and a war worth fighting, and won. She had surfaced. She was here. How was she? Renata said. Serafina. She forgave him, Marin said. Her mother nodded slowly, and then she said, the thing that closed the last open circle, the oldest one, the one that had been open since a Thursday in October. Your father, Renata said, would be so proud of you, and she did not say it like an accusation, this time the way she had said his name on the night of the eviction, the night the knowing fell to Marin. She said it like a gift. She reached out and took her daughter's face in both her worn hands, the hands that had sewn at a table late into the night for 30 years, and she said it again, looking right into her so there could be no mistake. He would be so proud, and so am I. And Marin, who had not let herself break since she folded a notice in the rain a lifetime ago, finally broke in her mother's hands on the porch of a house that was theirs in the spring, with the woods going quiet and gold around them. She let it all come, her father, the drowning, the fear, the fight, all of it, and her mother held her the way you hold someone you almost lost, and the two of them stood there a long time while the light went down behind the trees. They never went back to the city. The building they had been evicted from, the one her father died fighting for, was seized with the rest of Meridian's portfolio and made into housing that people could afford again, real homes for real families, so that the place that took her father gave shelter in the end to people like him. Marin did not know if that was justice. It was something. It was the closest the world comes. She went back to school that fall to finish what she had started before the water rose. She wrote her final thesis on the hidden rooms of old houses, on the things people seal behind walls, on the architecture of secrets, and she dedicated it to two men, to Gil Tavares, who taught her to read the bones of a building, and to a man the world had known as Emmett Vale, who built a whole house around the worst thing he ever did and left the truth where the right person would find it. She kept the cabin exactly as it was, but for one thing, down in the cellar behind the broken cinder wall she never fully closed, the great gray vault door still stood, empty now, the money gone, the books gone, the poison carried out into the daylight, and she left the door open. Always, she would not shut it, because some things, she told her mother, should stay open, so that you never forget what was hidden, so that you never forget that the truth was down here in the dark the whole time waiting, and that one day somebody good enough and stubborn enough came down the stairs and let it out. So here is where we leave her. A young woman on the porch of a house at the end of a washed-out road in the deep woods in the spring, 21 years old when the story started, put out into the rain with nothing. And here is the truth of it, the whole truth plain. Marin Tavares was 21 years old, and she had just been put out of the only home she had ever known. She had a little over $17,000 to her name, every cent her family had left in the world, and she spent almost all of it on a falling down cabin that a county clerk called a tear down 4 hours north of everything she knew. It was the best money she ever spent, because what she found under that house was never really the money. The money was poison, and she knew it. What she found was a dead man's truth, and 42 families saved, and a daughter's forgiveness 50 years late, and a mother brought back from the bottom of her grief, and a home that no one on this earth can ever take from her again. A stranger she never met left it there for her, a hard, frightened, sorry man who spent his whole life hiding and one last act giving. He left the firewood on the porch. He left the truth in the dark. He left it for whoever the house would choose, and the house chose a girl with her father's eyes who knew how to read the bones of things, and who, when the truth was finally in her hands, was brave enough to carry it out into the light. That is the whole story. And I want to leave you with one question tonight, the kind that has nothing to do with this story and everything to do with yours, because I think most of us, if we are honest, are carrying something a stranger left behind, a kindness, a lesson, a door somewhere that somebody opened for us when we had nothing. So tell me, what has a stranger left behind that quietly changed your life? I would truly like to know.